We're back with Michael Quinn for part 3 of our interview. As we've been discussing the Mormon hierarchy, wealth, and corporate power, we've done our best to dig into some of the details, but obviously we're not going to cover enough. So definitely purchase this book, published by Signature Books, to dig into the wonderful wealth of information that Michael shared with us about that book. I thought that we'd do our last segment and just kind of talk about Michael, where he is now, and maybe some of his views on the contemporary church. So I've just got like 20 questions, and we can just rifle through them,
Okay.
if that's all right.
Sure.
So recently the church released the Council of 50 Minutes. Was there anything new or interesting there?
Well, like I said, all I read the footnotes was to see if they quoted me and what other sources they quoted, and I actually did not even read one page of the text of those minutes.
You're not curious?
Well, it's not that I'm not curious. It's that I just don't read what I don't need to read for writing what I wanted to write. And there was nothing that I expected about finance in there that was significant for my book. And that's when it came out. It came out while I was still working on this book, putting on finishing touches. So I can't comment about those revelations other than what I've heard their editors say about them, and it's what I expected. I mean, the Mormon population despised the federal government by 1844 because they felt that they had been abandoned by the federal government, very much like the residents of Puerto Rico feel today. Brown-skinned people who don't get the same kind of respect or attention, and much in the way of disrespect from a national government trying to deal with their emergency situation, whereas the lily white residents of other parts of America get all that attention. And the Mormons felt not only about attention to their welfare, but actual evidence that they were under a fatal attack, that Joseph Smith had been kidnapped multiple times in Illinois and nearly dragged back to a certain death in Missouri. And in those minutes, they saw a federal government which was really limited by the Constitution. It had no power within the states. And that did not change until the Civil War. And that was why Joseph Smith said, I believe in the Constitution as far as it goes, but it does not go far enough in protecting human rights and religious rights. And he was certainly correct in that regard. And that attitude was very painful, even before the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, to Mormons who felt they'd been abandoned by the federal government when pleas went to the federal government. And so to find what I have only been reported, heard reported or read reported by the editors and other readers of those minutes, the shock that many of them had at the animosity that was expressed toward the federal government and toward the United States as a whole is not surprising to me. And I expected that in an article that I wrote in 1980 about those minutes, I said that I think that we will find in those minutes, if they were ever made available, sermons or talks, at least, that Joseph Smith gave that are reported and repeated nowhere else. And my understanding is that that is the case, that there are extensive summaries of his words, including apparently what the clerk intended as exact quotes. And that's a wonderful thing, and that's what I expected. I know that I talked to people who expected that there would be disclosures about polygamy, and they simply didn't understand the Nauvoo Council of 50 before Joseph Smith's death. there wouldn't have been any discussions of polygamy or the temple ordinances in the Council of 50 Minutes, because Joseph Smith chose 3 non-Mormons to be members of the Council of 50. And so those things that were sacred or secret or dangerous or criminal, as polygamy was, would not have been discussed in those minutes, because, or not found in those minutes, because he would not, and no one else who was in the know would have discussed them. And so people who were disappointed not to find those things in the published minutes didn't really understand the nature of the Council of 50. And so, again, I'm commenting on something I haven't read, which is always dangerous, and some of my critics have frequently done that with my own publications. But to the degree I dare do it about the Council of 50 Minutes, I think that they fulfill what I expected them to be, and will certainly provide the kind of details that historians love. And so, I never thought, in view of all the time that they were locked away and made unavailable, I never thought I would live to see their publication. And just as I never thought I would live to see the African Americans and Africans in Africa receive the priesthood. I just didn't expect that to happen. And so that's my response to the publication, to the degree that I can comment.
What's your response to the Gospel Topics essays that the church has released between 2013 and now on various topics?
Better late than never. My objection...
Have you read them?
Yes, all of them. And my objection is not that they're incomplete, because anything of that length is going to be incomplete. I think they lay out the major issues and the major problems in an honest way. It's not everything a historian would like. It's not everything that a probing Mormon would like to read about his or her heritage as a believer, and in some cases as a family. And for ancestral Mormons who go back to the 1830s or the 1840s. But I applaud what the general leadership allowed to do, these scholars to do, and they were obviously reviewed and edited by higher authorities. I have disappointments. One disappointment is that I have heard members of the church who have said they have never read those because those are just produced by the bureaucracy.
Or by anti-Mormons who have hacked into the church's website.
And I wish that the church would publish all of them. And as far as I don't read the Ensign, but has the church published those in full in the Ensign?
No, but they do, I think, include it on the apps, the mobile apps.
That's good enough.
Yeah.
That's not good enough. To counter this assumption and there are people who are willingly ignorant, not just in leadership, but among the rank and file of America, among the rank and file of all political parties, and within Mormonism, there are people who are willfully ignorant. And so I think one way to counter that willful ignorance of people who say, well, I'm not going to be bothered by or read what is in those essays, one way to counter it, we might not completely overcome it, it would be to publish those in the official Ensign magazine and publish them in serial form in the Church News, because the Church News has a wider readership than the Ensign. The Church News goes out to people throughout the world in a way that the Ensign doesn't. I was in the military, and in Munich, Germany, every week I got it was a delayed mailing, but I got a mailing of the Church News, and it was important. And actually, at that time, my wife and I weren't getting the Ensign, or at that time it was the Improvement Era. We weren't getting it because that was just a cost we could save. But the cost of the church news was so reasonable that it was like, why wouldn't we want that to keep up? Well, that's one disappointment, that would end any argument or excuse or justification for not reading or believing that this is the official view of the church. Now, having said that, it's only a partial view of these problem areas. Even though what is there is honestly written and carefully written by academics as approved by members of the hierarchy, more could be said. And what I wish that would happen in every seminary class throughout the world, that on Thursday, the same day that the Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency meet in the temples, that each teacher throughout the world, seminary teacher, would receive a paragraph to read about every one of these problem areas, and then would receive a packet that would inform them about how to respond to questions that their students might ask. Maybe their students wouldn't ask anything. But I think that should happen in every seminary throughout the world, because seminary students, teenagers, do not read the Ensign or the New Era to any extent, if at all. And despite the expectations and hopes and prayers of the headquarters of the church, that's a reality. And they only read what they want on the internet. And I think if this were made available to every seminary student who is generally forced out of bed, half asleep, to go to this class that they think is utterly boring in the mornings, for those who think it's boring, their ears would perk up if the teacher said, this is something that has been a problem area in the church and I want to read to you. So that is a disappointment. The other disappointment is that this is 20 years too late. By the late 1990s, the church leadership, if they were aware of what was happening, should have recognized that the evangelicals were creating websites that would pop up as the first hit on any inquiry, a Google inquiry on Mormon or Mormonism or LDS, to use problems in Mormon history and evidence, incontrovertible evidence in Mormon history, as sledgehammers to destroy the faith of anyone who did a Google search on LDS Mormon or Mormonism. And because there was nothing like these essays for the last 20 years, we've lost a generation. And I say we because I still see myself as a believing Mormon in a community of believing Mormons and in a community of transitioning Mormons who at once believed and who may still have members of their family and close friends who are believers. And because of this reluctance to deal honestly and openly with these problem areas in the past, we have lost, I'd say, at least hundreds of thousands of people who might not have been disturbed by the evangelical attacks on the internet if they had had a resource that they knew was published or circulated to them verbally, wonderfully, even at General Conference, on these issues. And I have to fault the First Presidency for that. That was their choice, and they allowed hundreds of thousands of previously devout Mormons to be, I think, victimized by evangelical Protestants.
And ex-Mormons.
And ex-Mormons, but most of whom have become evangelical Protestants.
I don't know about that.
But have aligned themselves with evangelical Protestants in this effort to keep people from being deceived, as both non-Mormons who are no longer believers in anything and evangelical Protestants believe is true of the claims of Mormonism. And I think that that you have to give us responsibility where responsibility is due, and I believe that rests on the shoulders of all of the first presidencies since 1996.
It must have been weird. It must have been weird for you and so many of your colleagues to have been excommunicated for sort of telling the truth about history, than to see 30 years later or 20 years later, whatever it was, all the church being candid. Was that weird to see Bushmen and others and the essays themselves sort of acknowledging things that you and others were excommunicated for?
No, it wasn't weird for me. I was happy.
You were angry a little bit?
No, I wasn't even a little bit angry. I was happy. And I've had a lot of people, including Peggy Fletcher Stack, who said, "Don't you feel disappointed that the essays have made available to the public what you got in trouble for talking about openly in your publications?" And yes, it is a fair question, but my answer has been consistent. I just, say, glory, glory, hallelujah, that the leadership has finally caught up with the reality of what Mormons in the trenches have been dealing with and have addressed that need. And I say never, better late than never, and I believe that. But the cost of 20 years waiting has been hundreds of thousands of disaffections. And some of those disaffected people are still participating in the temple, in sacrament meeting, in priesthood, and yet they are participating as quasi-believers because they have been so unnerved, disturbed, devastated by this assault on their faith using history as a weapon.
You say you still see them as prophets, seers, and revelators. You still believe in Mormonism, yet I guess one would ask, if they really are prophets, seers, and revelators, why didn't God tell them to be honest with the history, and why didn't they do that a lot earlier?
Well, Mormons don't believe in passive revelation, even though leaders of the church seem to expect that. They expect that God is going to just appear out of the clouds or send an angel to them or speak to them in the whisperings of the Spirit in specific ways that they not only did not anticipate, they do not want to hear. And so when I say that the men who are sustained as prophets, seers, and revelators, if I were a member of the church, I could raise my hand in a church meeting when asked, or in a conference, and say, I sustain them as prophets, seers, and revelators. And what I mean by that is that I earnestly believe, as a fundamental part of my faith, that they have that calling and they have that right to receive God's will. But because of a kind of spiritual indifference, a kind of lack of will and willpower, they expect God to tell them what they are not interested in hearing. And I feel that's why it took, 120 years for blacks to receive the priesthood? Because these culturally defined policies were a part of the tradition of the church, and the church leaders did not want to consider anything other than the tradition of the church. And yet they condemn the papacy for not wanting to accept anything other than the tradition of its church. And yes, it's a much longer tradition, which should in one way make Mormons more open to altering the tradition of the church. And instead, whether it was Joseph F. Smith or Heber J. Grant or George Albert Smith or David O. McKay, they expected God to tell them something that they really didn't want to hear.
Right. Have you read the CES letter?
No. Like I say, I read only things that I need to read. And things that are brought to my attention, and this one hasn't been until you mentioned it just now. When did this come out?
CES letter?
Yeah.
A few years ago.
Yeah, 21st century though? Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I'm 16, 17 years into the 21st century, and I'm still catching up.
Okay.
Because I'm living so much in the 19th century with writing books like this.
Okay. So what was your reaction to the November 2015 policy that the church came out with about LGBT individuals that basically making same-sex marriage an act of apostasy and making it so the children of same-sex married couples weren't allowed to get baptized until they were 18 and until they denounced the marriages of their parents?
All right. It was a consistent policy with the policy that Spencer W. Kimball adopted in 1979, and I saw on his desk in his private office in his home the correspondence that led to that decision, that for sub-Saharan African polygamists who are wanting to join the church, for them to be allowed to join the church, they had to abandon their polygamous families, denounce the practice of plural marriage, and remain monogamous for the rest of their lives, even though they were living a form of marriage that was, in some cases, statutorily allowed in these countries, and certainly by tradition allowed, even if not statutorily allowed in these countries. And these women who were honored women in polygamous families in sub-Saharan Africa, who were overwhelmingly black, were turned into abandoned women and became rejected within their villages as a price for their husband becoming a priesthood member and a holder of the or a member, baptized member of the LDS Church in sub-Saharan Africa. And when I learned about that, it was a cross that I bore as a member of the church from 1979 onward, because what it did was that Spencer Kimball gave with one hand in June 1978 and took away from black people throughout the world something as precious, family stability, legitimate children who by church decree had to become illegitimate in sub-Saharan Africa. And I regarded the 2008 decision about children of gay couples.
2015?
2000, I thought it was
2008 was Prop 8. 2015
Oh, yeah, 2015, excuse me.
No problem.
Yeah, I'm mixing up tragedies. I regarded that as I regarded that 1979 decision of Spencer W. Kimball, who I deeply loved as a person, who I admired as a person, and who I regarded as a prophet. But what he did in early 1979, which is a church policy that is followed throughout the polygamous world in every culture, no matter where it is today, that policy was anti-Christian, that policy is anti-family, and that is how I regarded the announcement regarding GLBT parents and their children, as anti-Christian and anti-family, and something which I believe is one of the reasons that God weeps for his people and his church. So it is one of the policies that many people have asked me, under what circumstances would you ever seek to rejoin the LDS Church?
Because Maxine did it, right?
Yeah. But my answer has been that when they allow polygamous families to exist honorably as continued polygamous families and do not require their abandonment or their breakup as a price of either baptism in the church or ordination of those who should be ordained, then I would consider returning to the church. And people have been surprised. You mean gay issues are not a part of that? And I say gay issues are, in my view, tangential to that, because the position of the church regarding gay marriage and children being raised by gays, either adopted or born because of the genetic parentage of these gay couples, those policies extend as an extension of the what I regard as racist denial to polygamists who just happen to be black. I don't think so. And so I see that African decision that applied specifically to Africans when it was made and then extended throughout the world to all brown-skinned people who enter into polygamous marriages, I see that as the origin of so much of the discrimination against the unconventional marriage hopes and realities of GLBT people. So I don't expect ceilings in the temple of legally married gay couples. That is a privilege, but I see the recognition in family life of married gay couples and of polygamously married couples, whether they are blacks or whether they are whites or whether they are Asians or whether they are brown-skinned Polynesians, as fundamental to the message of the church and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I will never consider joining the church again until those policies are changed. They are not revelations. They are policies which are defined just as the exclusion of priesthood was defined by personal prejudice and cultural prejudice and bias. And that's my view of those issues, both the one you asked about and what I think is its origin in the 1979 exclusion.
Regarding the LGBT stuff, if we draw from your first two books, there are a lot of reports that this was something Elder Nelson did once he became president of the Quorum of the 12 when Boyd K. Packer died, that maybe he went straight to President Monson and bypassed the full Quorum of the 12 and sort of making this policy in effect. Does that sound like something that could be done? Does that make sense?
No. My understanding, and again, I'm not, except through second and third hand or faith-promoting rumors, aware of the internal operations of the church in the 21st century, as I was for most of the 20th century. I do not have that knowledge. But my understanding is that this originated with Thomas S. Monson alone, and that his counselors and the Quorum of the 12 accepted it as the president's proclamation. And because of the Doctrine and Covenants requirement for unanimity in all decisions, they fell in line, despite misgivings. And in those earlier books, I gave examples of apostles in particular who had done that very thing with something that they disagreed with, but they felt they had to acknowledge and support the president of the church and what he was asking them to do. And I see this as simply another example, but I see it having no other origin than Thomas S. Monson. And why? That's a matter of speculation, but I think I am very secure in my conclusion that he alone was responsible for that. and that others either willingly or unwillingly or hesitantly or eagerly went along with it. But it did not originate with Russell or with Nelson. No, Bednar or whoever you were saying. Nelson. It did not originate with them. It originated with Thomas S. Monson. Why? That's a whole other issue.
So Nelson came up a few months after and basically said it was doctrine, that it wouldn't be changed.
Absolutely wrong. I'm not disputing the fact that that's what he believes, but it is not doctrine. It was not revelation. It was prejudice dressed in the garments of God's word.
What does it mean for this to be God's true church, and yet such egregious violations can happen to people?
Well, I've said this before, and so this is nothing new in the public arena from me saying this, but I believe that the LDS Church is a divine institution run by the damned human race. And so that invites the expectation on my part that there will be shocking, disturbing, damning occurrences within an organization that I nonetheless regard as divine in origin. I mean, Abraham, for example, look at the Old Testament. Abraham, who would regard Abraham as a exemplar of being a husband and a father? He tried to kill two of his sons, and he tried to kill one of his wives, one of his sons by coming after him with a knife, the other son and one of his wives by throwing them out into the desert to die. Who would look at him as a example of what fatherhood and a husbandhood should be? But I don't dispute that he spoke with God face to face. I don't dispute that he was a prophet. I believe that to the core of my being. But was he somebody that I could admire? No, I could not admire him. And I'll only condemn those behaviors that I regard as condemnable. But that does not alter, in my view, the fact of his humanity and his weakness and his sinfulness, and all of us are sinners. When we commit sins, that doesn't make us any less good human beings. It makes us human. It allows us to do things that are, in some cases, terrible. And we can trot out all the examples from every headline of every newspaper, no matter if it's published in Utah or in Bangladesh. But the horrible experiences that are a part of humanity does not mean, in my view, that we fail to be the children of God. We are just the damned human race. And this is what, in Mormon view, in Mormon theology, we all accepted as a condition of existence and to make the best of it. So in my view, the members of the church who are called prophets, seers, and revelators not only have that title, they have that obligation. And if they fail to be prophets, seers, and revelators, that hurts those who are believers in them as prophets, seers, and revelators, but it damages their relationship with God. But that is between them and God. It is not for me to judge them. I can report it, and I have reported consequences. And I have mentioned consequences here of African women returning to their village as pariahs when they had previously been, prior to the contact of their husbands with Mormonism, honored women, honored wives. That's a consequence, and I condemn that. But ultimately, even though I feel it was a anti-Christian, anti-family policy for Spencer W. Kimball, and an anti-Christian and anti-family policy for Thomas S. Monson to announce these two prohibitive policies and procedures regarding people and their family lives. I can't judge them because, I mean, I feel these are better men than I have ever been. But that doesn't mean they are not sinners. We are all sinners. And we all, like Paul, the Apostle Paul said, we see through a glass darkly. And if I think they are willfully blind and willfully ignorant on certain matters, maybe that's a condemnation of me and my pride and my arrogance, that I think I'm so well informed, better than they. I see things in such a broad view that they don't see. Maybe that reflects on me more than them. But what I do know is that we are all trapped in this mortal life. We are all sinners. We are all ignorant. And we all act upon our sinful desires and our fearful desires and our selfishness and our cultural training. And as a part of that, we hurt people. We hurt people in our families. We hurt longtime friends. We hurt strangers. And are they any more responsible for hurting people than I am for the people I've hurt? I don't know. But I do feel they bear responsibility. But that's between them and God, even though it may hurt me, even though it may hurt you, even though it may hurt millions, I think, of teenage boys and girls who know that they are attracted to their same kind, those who have the same kind of bodies that they have. It has deeply hurt them. And yet, I still regard these men as well-intentioned, as good men, in many ways, better men than I have ever been. But I also regard them by my faith as prophets and seers and revelators. But in many cases, they have turned a blind eye and expected passively to receive revelations that they don't want to hear.
Many of our listeners are just perplexed that you're able to still believe, and you addressed that really directly in our first interview where you talked about the spiritual experiences you had as a young kid that I think form at least important foundations for your faith. Mm-hmm. But I think it's safe to say that the church's growth is slowed. Some are starting to say the church is in decline in Europe and in Asia, that maybe the church's days of growth, even in the United States, are coming to an end within the next 20 or 30 years. And then when you look at the mistakes that Joseph Smith made with polygamy and polyandry, when you look at the Book of Abraham not sort of holding up to scientific scrutiny, you look at the problems of the Book of Mormon with DNA, with anachronisms, and all the other problems archaeologically and anthropologically with the Book of Mormon. When you look at the racism that's been there, the homophobia, the sexism, all the problems with the church's truth claims, there's just so many people now that are just, they've reviewed the history that you and others helped bring to light, and they just say there's no possible way that this church is what it claims to be. The scientific evidence is overwhelming against it, and now the church is starting to decline, potentially. It's fair to just say, how could this be God's plan if every single claim seems to fall apart when facing, true scientific or logical scrutiny? How can anyone these days maintain a belief that an angel delivered golden plates to Joseph, that God told Joseph to be a polygamist, that the Book of Abraham is scripture, that this church is led by God? How do you continue belief given all those problems? And how do you encourage others to maintain belief given all those problems?
I look at my experience and my faith as a gift. And it was a gift that, as you say, began with metaphysical, however you want to write, miraculous experiences I had as a child and onward. When I was a missionary, I was a branch president as well for a period of time, and I was excommunicating boys who had been baptized by deception, by missionaries thinking that they were doing God's will, or who knew they weren't doing God's will but wanted to keep the mission presidents off their backs about baptism statistics. And when I was in the midst of doing that, I became what I've called an atheist. It was not an atheist who could list all the reasons why I was an atheist. I just could no longer believe in the church, could no longer believe in Joseph Smith, could no longer believe in David O. McKay, who was then the prophet of the church. And it wasn't that I had forgotten all of these experiences that had given me a testimony of everything I now disbelieved as a missionary, 20 years old, and who ultimately excommunicated 3 times the number of people I baptized as a missionary. But I think when I look back at that, it was easier for me to believe that none of it mattered with regard to Mormonism than that all of it mattered. And so I lost my faith, the faith I had since childhood. And I had to pray, and I did pray multiple times a day without telling my companion what I was going through. Oh God, if there is a God, help me to know it again. So I know what that sense, although the reasons are very different, but I know what that sense of nothingness feels like when you have gone from a situation of believing to a situation of, whether you can define why or not, you no longer believe. And I was going through hell during those weeks, and I was standing up in front of this branch every Sunday, and I felt, what am I doing here? And ultimately I decided I was going to resign as a missionary and resign from the church, if that was possible. That really wasn't at the time. You would ask to be excommunicated, and that was the way of getting out of the church voluntarily. But I felt that I had a few weeks to resolve this, and if I didn't resolve it in a few weeks, I could not stay in the situation I was in. And so I did pray earnestly, as I described. And eventually, in its way, for reasons and a process I really don't understand, although as an outsider, and with my left brain, I could say, well, I talked myself back into a testimony. But the presence of the Spirit that I had known since childhood returned, and the convictions of the church returned with me. It did not alter my conviction that a mission president and missionaries had violated the lives of young boys in particular. There weren't very many young women who were baptized during this deceitful proselytizing program. But even though I certainly continued to believe and continued to learn about and ask about and research what I saw as a disastrous, demonic misuse of power and misuse of persuasion, I was asking about it and researching it and then eventually writing about it as a believer. And I can't really explain why. I think, in my view, that there are gifts, and I have the gift of faith, not just simply the gift to believe on the faith of others. And when missionaries later, when I was in 21, 22, or 21, because I was out of the mission by 22. But when a year later, when I was his own leader and an assistant to the president, not the chief assistant, but one of his assistants, missionaries would come to me and say, I don't understand why I can't have a testimony and say I know the church is true like you do, Elder Quinn. And they were in tears usually, and they felt horribly guilty that there was something wrong with them because they couldn't believe in the way, or they didn't have, quote, the burning of the bosom or the burning of the spirit. And I just would say something that I couldn't have said to them before that horrible month when I was a branch president and missionary and doubted everything. I had empathy that I had never had prior to that because I didn't know what it was like to be a complete doubter. And I was grateful in retrospect for that experience. And so I told these young men that faith is a gift and that they may not have the gift of faith and they may not even have the gift to believe on others who do have that faith. But they have gifts, and their gift may be in music, their gift may be in empathy, their gift may be in many different directions, but it's a godly gift, and that I cannot explain a testimony of why some who earnestly seek for it never receive it, and why others who are blindsided by the testimony that comes to them. And then likewise, I can't explain why people doubt, because in some cases it's not rational. It's not I examined this, and this, and they disturbed me, and they devastated me, and I can no longer believe, as you've just given me this litany. There are many people who no longer believe, who cannot give you that litany. They just no longer believe. And they can't give any kind of academic or intellectual reason for it. I see my belief as non-rational. I'm a very rational person, and I can trot out and I can talk about the evidences for everything you've described. But for me, that is secondary to this non-rational faith I have. And whether you see that as a delusion or as a gift, those are probably the only options. And I can look at every one of my metaphysical experiences and give you a Freudian explanation for it, or a post-Freudian explanation, or a brain chemical explanation, which I think in many ways is superior to Freud, the brain synapses. But having said that, and knowing those realities, I still remain a believer. And I don't, when I was speaking to the group in San Francisco, somebody came upward and said, I wish I had your faith. And I said, there's a little dirty secret about my faith that I need to acknowledge to you, and that is that it's not rational. And so that's really the bottom line.
And the fact that other people in other religions have had similar types of experiences testifying to them that those other churches are true and all the churches can't be true. How do you make sense of that?
Well, I grew up in a church that did not claim to have all truth. I grew up in a church where I was taught from over the pulpit, and I heard sermons by people like Hugh B. Brown, who was a member of the First Presidency, that we don't claim all truth. We seek all truth.
But we claim to be God's one true church.
We claim to be a true church, in my view, but I see all churches, even the Baptists, as having truth. And as much as I gnash my teeth about evangelical Protestants, they have truth, and they have experiences that are true. and they have experiences that are divine. And I feel this is true of every religious persuasion. You can find truth in Buddhism, you can find truth in Islam, you can find truth in Wicca, you can find truth in Santeria. There is no limit to where you can find truth. And for me, that's 19th century Mormonism. John Taylor, who was an apostle when he said this, not president of the church, but he said, if Satan has truth, I want it. There's no limit. And so for me, Mormonism, the Mormonism I believe in, 19th century Mormonism, in all its boasts and arrogance, was a Mormonism that did not claim to be complete. And it was like the outstretched arms in the Basilica of St. Paul, or St. Peter rather, St. Peter's Basilica. And the Catholic Church definitely hasn't lived up to that symbol of willing to embrace not only all the people in the world who might convert to Christianity or to Catholicism, but in my view, the symbol is the willingness to embrace all truth, whether it comes from Charles Darwin or George Freud or from Buddha or from Muhammad, to embrace all truth no matter what its source. And for me, the ultimate expression of that was John Taylor saying, if Satan has truth, I want it. And so that's my Mormonism. And that's why I resist so much this claim that Mormons have the only truth or the only true church. What I think Mormons have is what Brigham Young taught. He said, there are prophets throughout the world, and they give revelations, and they are true revelations, but they are true revelations for their people. We have prophets who've given us revelations, and they are for our benefit, and that we proselytize and we send missionaries throughout the world to let them know about our prophets and our revelations. And that's what I think Mormonism is all about.
So many paths, basically.
Many paths. And those who say they cannot believe in smorgasbord Mormonism, I don't think understand religion and do not understand Mormonism. There are things that prophets have preached that are false, either theologically false or scientifically false or false in human behavior. And there are things they have preached that are true. And I think that you need to be a smorgasbord Mormonism to take that which is true and beneficial and upbuilding and ignore that. Not necessarily condemn it, but you just don't take it off the table. And it could be that you don't like like I don't like yellow vegetables. And so I avoid those. I don't condemn them, I don't condemn people who like them, but I don't myself indulge. And I think that's the way all Mormons should be about Mormonism. And these claims by apostles themselves in the 20th century and before, that we do not want to be cafeteria Mormons or we do not want to be smorgasbord Mormons, simply don't define reality. The reality of the church is that there are things about it that are, and it's about its past and its history, that are blood-curdling. And there are things about it that are inspirational to the heavens. And it's a package. But you don't have to accept it as a package. And you can accept it as, yes, it is all, it's all inclusive and it has these dark spots and the bright spots and the dull spots. But it's all part of what is Mormonism. And I think that each of us has not only a right, but an obligation to make those kinds of decisions. And in that way, we are cafeteria Mormons. And we are smorgasbord Mormons. And I think that's what God wants us to be. And despite the comfort that comes to people in an organization to have lockstep beliefs and to follow lockstep policies, that I think is spiritually damaging. That's my view.
It's time to wrap up. We have a quick question from the audience. Do you want to ask a?
Sure. I don't know how appropriate this question will be now, given the last hour of us discussing more soul-searching topics, which I appreciate.
I don't talk about my tax returns with anybody.
But to return to the topic of finances, and I wrote down my questions so I can stay on point here. You're quoted in the Tribune article talking about faith-promoting stories, or a faith-promoting story of the church and finances. And I wanted to bring up a recent transaction and to get your read of it. In August of this year, the LDS Church paid an undisclosed amount of an estimated minimum of $100 million for an office building in Richardson, Texas. The purchase is unremarkable, except that it came with a 10-year lease for 1,700 Raytheon employees, 2.5% of Raytheon's total workforce. Raytheon is the third largest defense contractor in the United States after Lockheed Martin and Boeing. And to give you a picture, in 2015, the federal government obligated to pay Raytheon $12.3 billion. Given the international backdrop that in 2016, the U.S. dropped roughly 30,000 bombs in 7 different countries, and that the U.S. military complex depends on suppliers like Raytheon in order to do this, is it faith-promoting to contemplate that the LDS Church profits directly from these war efforts?
Well, it's a similar question that the LDS Church encourages young men to volunteer in these efforts, which the Church has since 1898, as a part of its accommodation to the national environment. I don't claim to be somebody who's consistent. I'm a pacifist, yet I volunteered for to be in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. Just a few months after the Tet Offensive demonstrated that it was a lost cause. I had friends who died in that war. I had friends who went to Canada to protest that war. I didn't either. I never served in country, as was the term during that time for being in Vietnam. And I didn't become a war protester. I was quietly a pacifist, even while I was a military intelligence officer reading top secret documents in southern Germany. I think that the benefit or the profit from the military-industrial complex is simply the other side of the coin from the LDS Church encouraging young men to volunteer for service in the military-industrial complex. And there are ethical problems, without question. The Church absolves anyone who kills in war of murder. And yet, dropping the second bomb on Nagasaki 3 days after the first, was that a fair time period to allow the Japanese government to accept unconditional surrender? And if not, it was a war crime of extraordinary, perhaps the most extraordinary kind of commission. I don't object, and I understand, and I think Hiroshima was a necessary action. I think Nagasaki was not. And yet, there are people of good spirit, Christians, who disagree with me and would say that in that kind of war, fighting those kinds of enemies, that anything that could shorten the war, no matter when or what, they were righteous. I can't resolve the ethical issues. Anytime you deal with war, there are huge ethical issues. Anytime you deal with government, there are huge ethical issues. Anytime you deal with money, lots of money, even beyond a little kid stealing money from his parents or grandparents, when you deal with lots of money, there are huge ethical problems in use of that power. I don't have any objection to power, any kind of power. Power is inevitable. That's like objecting to breathing. Power exists in families, parents over children, older siblings over younger children or younger siblings. And when there's large amounts of money or large numbers of people who believe that somebody is a prophet, there is the potential for abuse without question. So for me, it's not the existence of power. Even as a socialist, I can say that about billionaires. I don't have any problem with people who are billionaires. As a matter of fact, it's that spread the money around. Nobody should be poor. Nobody should be eating paint off the walls of their room because they're hungry, which children throughout the world do. So it's a question of how does the LDS Church use its power? And I can see certain within their worldview rationales from profiting from the military industrial system, the complex, and seeing it as simply no more participation in Babylon or in the world, which are Mormon phrases and concepts, than encouraging young men to, out of patriotism, no matter what country they're in, to serve in the militaries of those countries. And yet there are huge, huge consequences that are tragic out of that. So I can't answer, in any definitive way. And one of the things that I expected to be criticized for in the book is that although I talk about lawsuits in the 19th century and early 20th century, I don't deal with all of the lawsuits that have been filed against the church over alleged business violations or problems of unfair competition or whatever in the late 20th century and the 21st century. And the main reason I did not, I could have acknowledged that in a sentence, but what source would I use? And there's no source that I know of, that as an academic source that I could deal with, that I could cite. And I could cite individual cases like that cherry farmers, maybe not the right word, but you owned a cherry orchard in Provo and filed suit against Zion's not Zion Savings Bank, but Zion Securities and the LDS Church over issues involved with the purchase and competition that he felt destroyed his livelihood. The problem is that if I cited any of those examples, I would have to get into the nitty-gritty of were these justifiable lawsuits and how did they end? Did they win? Did they not win? And I just couldn't deal with that. I just couldn't deal with that thicket. And so I chose not to acknowledge that there were lawsuits in the late 20th century with the rise of corporate Mormonism to the degree that it arose. And I'll acknowledge that as a weakness. It's just that I didn't know of a way to do it in a way that I could feel was academically honest. That I couldn't refer to that cherry grove owner in Provo without knowing whether this was a frivolous lawsuit as judged by a jury or judged by a judge. How it turned out, and I really even don't know now how it turned out. I didn't follow it that closely in the newspaper reports. Well, that's why I left it out, and I can be faulted for not doing that. It wasn't an effort to whitewash the corporate church that I was describing in the 1990s and the 21st century. It was just simply that those were issues that were like, they were like a quagmire that I just didn't think I'd ever be able to get out of. So that's my response to you, that there are ethical problems, and I acknowledge them, and I really can't sort them out. And I know that even if I did come up with an explanation, it would be unsatisfactory to you, or it would be unsatisfactory to someone who disagrees with you, because generally I see so many sides of an issue, and I try to empathize with people on all sides of every issue where I see conflict, that I could be faulted for being on the fence, or faulted for not taking a position, when I may have a position, but it is not a yes or no, black and white, right or wrong kind of thing. That's, I'm sure, an unsatisfactory response, and far longer than you deserve to hear. But that's, that's where I am.
Any responses satisfactory?
So in some sense, we've had quite an interview, and in some sense, I still want more, but we do have to end. So I just want to thank everyone who's joined us, who's made it through this full interview, either here in person or on audio or video. Michael, I want to thank you for your generosity and being willing to spend so much time with us and to give us such comprehensive and detailed answers. So
No, thank you.
it's been a real, it's a real treat. The Mormon Hierarchy, Wealth and Corporate Power. Please buy it. Thanks to Signature Books for making it possible. Thanks everyone for making this event possible. Sharon Price, Amy Grubbs, Cody Layton, everyone at the Open Stories Foundation. We really wish you the best and really appreciate
Thank you.
all that you've done for us as a people. If you guys will just join me in giving Michael Quinn our thanks for all he's done for us.
Thank you.